And welcome to The Bottom Line, where we unpack some of the main business and economic stories of the day. People live these days often up to the age of 100. While this is a positive development, it also requires that society cares for the elderly, which is proving to be a challenge both socially and financially. These days, a state pension is nowhere near capable of covering these sorts of needs, both medical and financial, and family members are often unable and often don't want to look after family members. A recent report from the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development tells us about these recent, rather concerning findings. I'm now joined by Mark Pearson, Deputy Director of the OECD, to explain the details. Hello, and thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So, please tell us about perhaps one or two of the key findings of this report.
Well, I think the main thing is that, as you say, we're aging very, very rapidly. And that means that we're reaching the point where there's going to be a lot more old people and not that many people of working age to look after them. And that's really putting a lot of pressure on our social systems. And about one person in two aged over 80 is going to need some form of help. They won't be able to go out and buy their own shopping, do their own bathing and so on. They're going to need support. So who's going to provide that support? At the moment, in the past, we relied a lot on family members and on friends. But that's not going to work in the future. There's not going to be enough people. And so what we've been looking at is the costs of providing care, the support that people need in order to live with dignity in their old age. And it's a lot.
And that key word, dignity. Institutionalized care is not actually readily available for the elderly in Poland. Your findings suggest that actually it's twice the median income for the elderly here in Poland, which happens to be the highest in the OECD countries. And this is with the support of public benefits. What are your recommendations?
Look, I mean, there's some things that you can do in order to spend what money you do spend more efficiently. Make sure that it's targeted well, make sure different levels of government work better together. And that doesn't always happen at the moment. And so I think having some sort of law which makes it clear what's the responsibilities, that would help a bit. But it's not going to help enough. Ultimately, what's going to be needed is more money. I don't see a way around that. And at the moment, Poland spends around about 0.5 percentage point of GDP on public support for long-term care. It's going to need to go up a lot more because, as you say, that amount of support at the moment, it's not enough to make long-term care affordable. So you're faced with this terrible dilemma if your family member gets to need help. You can't provide sufficient help, and yet there isn't enough money in order to be able to pay out of pocket for that care. So I think we are looking at what new sources of funding you could find. And we know it's not easy. There's many, many demands on public budgets at the moment. But this is the sort of thing that we can't really ignore. It will come as a great wave of demand, I think, for more support for people in old age, because we can't let our relatives live in poverty, without support when they're at the end of their lives.
Well, it suggests that there should be some sort of wider restructuring. The title of the report, Is Care Affordable for Older People, is concerning because the answer is, of course, it should be. And if there are any doubts, changes should be implemented right here, right now.
And the answer at the moment is no, it's not affordable. And not just in Poland, in a lot of countries, but it's particularly bad in Poland. The amount of support compared to the costs of care is such a huge gap, as you say, twice the median income for somebody with severe needs. I mean, the options are what some other countries have done. They've introduced a new form of insurance for people in old age. That's Germany, most recently Slovenia, Austria, Japan. But it's expensive. You know, in Germany, you're paying between 2.6 and 4.2% of your salary in the extra tax just for long-term care. So it's quite a lot of money. There are other alternatives. In France, as your report said earlier, you work a day for free, and that money goes to pay for long-term care. Or Portugal, for example, has taxes on alcohol, tobacco, betting that it puts directly into supporting care to make it more affordable for people.
Do you think the government should take more responsibility for essentially its former workforce in its old age? And dare I say, why does it not take more responsibility?
Look, I think there's no choice. I think it will have to. I don't think this can be left to a market. It just doesn't work. There's not enough money there. And we're not talking about everybody needing this. So it is a case of insurance, finding a way to insure those people who really do need help as they get older. Why is it ignored? It's not a sexy topic, is it? I mean, up until now, nobody's been very keen on talking about people in their very old age. There's a feeling that maybe the families should be responsible for doing that. It's not possible anymore to rely on families. So I think this is a case of politicians catching up with societal changes, and they will need to find the money somehow. And the sooner they do it, the more certainty people will have about how they will live in old age.
What kind of fiscal policy changes are necessary to ensure that the government actually supports the needs of the long-term needs of the elderly? Because, you know, public benefits, higher pensions. I mean, clearly what we have at the moment isn't enough. I mean, the elderly here in Poland are really at the risk of serious poverty.
Yes, they are. If they need care, they're going to struggle. That's definitely true. Some things that we suggest that you should look at are property taxes, so basically taxes on housing, which is often not taxed as much as it could be, and a few countries manage to do that more than Poland. VAT could be, some part of that could be allocated to paying for long-term care, or extra taxes on income. But, you know, none of these...
That's something that won't be very welcome, will it?
Nothing is really welcome. Nobody really likes the taxes. On the other hand, nobody really likes the idea that their parents might be left without the care that they need. So I think it will happen, and somehow we need to find that fiscal space in order to be able to do it.
Are there any concrete recommendations in your report that could be welcomed by the government? Is there any sort of communication between the OECD and the government, perhaps? I
think the government's quite keen on doing something here. I mean, today at the meeting that we had ministers from the Ministry of Family, the Ministry of Labour, Ministry of Health. That's a very good start to have them working together to work out what it is that they mean by care, who's responsible for what.
Because it's not just taking on responsibility, because there's also the issue of the quality of care that is received. That's
true, and we do worry about the quality of care because we often don't even bother measuring it. And we've seen in other countries you do have some big scandals in care homes. We even saw it during COVID, very poor quality of care. And you know, I think that's something that if you don't put in the right structure early on about, you know, how many carers are needed, what's the food needed, the hygiene, dignity, privacy, things like that. If you don't get those issues sorted out early on, then the risk is that you get cowboys coming into the sector and they undermine public trust in the sector. So I do think getting a quality framework that you measure and assess all the different providers of care is something that should be done urgently, yes.
Is this perhaps an area that will be taken over by the private sector? Because it is being privatised. There are some luxury care homes. Obviously, this is not something that is available to many, but is it something that perhaps should be incentivised for the private sector to perhaps take over properly?
I think this is an area where the private sector can be trusted, can be encouraged to provide care. I think as providing that you have a proper framework to assess the quality, to make sure that people are not being abused in every sense of the word in the care homes. Yes, I think the private sector does have a role. And in many of the countries with the best quality of care for older people in the world, it's often largely provided by the private sector. So I do think this is potentially a business opportunity in Poland as this sector expands.
And we're looking at 0.4 trillion for both OECD and non-OECD countries, and it's expected to double by 2050. And we mentioned funding a little bit earlier on, but who is really responsible for sourcing that funding?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm not sure that we have really said who's responsible for sourcing it. If nobody else does, then people will be selling their homes in order to be able to get enough money in order to be able to pay for care. That's politically dynamite. People really don't like being forced out of their homes. Children don't like being forced out of their homes in order to pay for their parents' care. So it's politically dangerous not to sort out a way of paying for long-term care. That's why I think ultimately governments will need to put in a system of paying for care, insurance system of some sort.
And just a final question. If people had more children, do you think that the responsibility of looking after the elderly would be just more spread out and it would just simply be easier?
Yes, I do. But of course, that's easy to say.
Yes, of course.
Not so easy to actually arrange. But yes, I do. I think one of the problems that we've got is that
it's the broader demographic question,
right.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it's a shrinking workforce and an expanding number of people who may need care in older age. And that does put pressure. It puts pressure on wages, it puts pressure. I mean, how many people do we want to be working in the care sector compared with other sectors? So, yes, I do think that's a very important issue, and we do really need to look at why people are having so many fewer children than they say that they want. So I think that's a bigger issue even than this long-term care.
So it's not just this issue, but it's a much broader demographic issue that we're looking at. Okay, we're going to end our conversation there. Mark, thank you so much for coming into the studio.
My pleasure, thank you.
And we were joined by Mark Pearson, Deputy Director of the OECD. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I was your host, Marie Cato. Join us every weekday for Business Arena at 5 p.m. CET on TVP World. And for the latest in regional business, follow us on X and on tvpworld.com. And for more news and features, stay with us on TVP World. Goodbye.